You said you wanted to counter the podcast bro allegations against Islam.
Okay, yeah.
What did you mean by that?
Well, I think that we're living in a time where Islam is in pretty much every single headline possible, usually for bad reasons. And I think even me, to be honest, I'm sure we're going to get into it, before I kind of discovered Islam and like looked into the religion, I was sort of put off by its representation, its sort of depiction against modernity, that type of stuff. When the reality is, you only need to do a bit of discovery to find out how like beautiful, profound, intellectual it really is. And I think we're doing a disservice, both the Muslim community itself, because I'm not some crazy apologist where I like defend every Muslim's behavior online, particularly with like the kind of trends of like your Andrew Tates of the world. I don't think they do a good job of representing Islam. I also don't obviously think that people who don't know much about Islam do a good job of representing it. So my sort of depiction or my journey to finding out the truth has sort of been uncovering a bit of like a gem that's kind of hidden amongst the noise. And I guess that's kind of what I meant by it. But when you hear the term podcast bros allegations around Islam, what do you think then? What are the headlines that come out?
Well, what it makes me instantly think of is this discourse of Islamification of the West, and that always being directly linked to civilizational collapse. Multiculturalism has failed. Muslims are migrating in mass numbers to the UK. They're having more babies than the native population, and this is going to lead to conflict, etc., etc. That's what I think of. And it's an issue that's as close as possible to home for a guy that's grown up in Brighton who's English for me, because I've spent a lot of time in Saudi Arabia over the course of the last year. I've spent a quarter of the last year there. So most of my friends, or a large majority, are in Saudi Arabia. Muslims that grown up in
they're Saudi,
the Holy Land. They're Saudis. And I really wanted to have you on to have this discussion, because every time I go back there, both to Saudi Arabia, but also to Qatar or to the UAE, which is barely a Muslim country anymore, but it's still got a lot of Islamic influence. The reality I see there on the ground with these people that are literally living in the Holy Land, it's very, very, very different to what you'd see in a GB News headline. So I thought it would be really interesting to get your story of your conversion to Islam, and also a more anecdotal general sense of what Islam means to you as a young Gen Z guy, given that we see all of these headlines that are concerned with young men turning to Islam, converting, and that being a negative thing for the West.
Yeah, I think the most important thing to realize is that the opposition to Islam, right, is not a unique thing, in the sense that Islam has been teed up as the enemy against this idea of Judeo-Christian morality. But the history of Judeo-Christian morality itself, it lacks substance as a term, and even as a sort of identity marker. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that throughout all its history, Judeo-Christian morality has been defined by an opposition to another, right?
What do you mean by that? Unpick that a little bit more.
So the term first came around in the 1930s, and the reason it came around for good reason in the US. So George Orwell was one of the first people to actually even use the term in the first place, is because of the fact that anti-Semitism was rampant, and particularly it came from European Christians. So the likes of Mussolini, Hitler, big anti-Semites, they inspired Christian movements in the US to be particularly anti-Semitic. So a group of intellectuals and those of Christian backgrounds decided not really to use that Christian civilization term anymore, but actually to include Jewish people, because obviously, they are also the children of Abraham. They preceded Christianity. And so Judeo-Christian or Judeo-Christianity started becoming the kind of conventional term people use to describe the morality that defined Western society. So it started off as that. It started off as that endeavor. And then once the sort of fascism started to kind of seep away in people's minds as, post-World War and things like that, in America, then what you get is the next big enemy, which is the Red Scare, communism, the atheist communists of Russia and these sorts of things. And as a result, the enemy then shifted to like Soviet Russia, communism, etc. So again, you're seeing Judeo-Christians being defined as opposing these ideals, right? And then more things happen throughout history, and then the threat of Russia and the Soviet Union collapses and things like that, and then people's minds shift finally to Islam, right? And then we start seeing like academics, I think his name was Bernard Lewis or something like that, who wrote the sort of preceding ideas towards this collapse of civilization, like, the Huntington theory that Islam is like, incompatible with democracy and things like that, that there's a new enemy in the world, which is Islam. And the reason why I think that's important to even like, before we get to that question around like, how did we get here with these like headlines and those narratives, is because it's important to note that this kind of moral identity has always been defined as a negation of the other, right? And as a result of that has been the kind of foundations for a lot of this like discourse that we have in the modern day. And I think you get some really damaging implications for that, because on the one hand, when you really interrogate what Judeo-Christian morality means, nothing really comes up. But if you actually understand Islam and look into it for itself, then you see a lot of substance. So like a positive definition is what you call it in philosophy.
Could you steelman maybe a Christian's side of this argument? Someone like Glenn Scrivener writing a book, The Air We Breathe, speaking about these Judeo-Christian values that underpin our everyday actions, this morality, this sea that we swim in, even as atheists, underpins our civilization, things like human rights, a belief in equality, a belief in freedom. He would argue that these are all Judeo-Christian values that we didn't have before in the Roman Empire. The idea that you could just discard a 3-year-old baby because you didn't want it and chuck it into a rubbish heap, that was normal back then. Could you maybe see the other side of the argument and interrogate that a little bit? What would a Christian or someone who's Jewish say about these values that you say don't carry any substance? And importantly, I'd also like to hear what you would say are the Islamic values that do have substance in comparison to these.
So that is the more sophisticated understanding of Judeo-Christian morality. But the way it's used in its conventional term is not the sophisticated understanding, right? So most of the right-wing pundits you see, when they talk about the values that they stand for, is always talking about in opposition to Islam, this enemy, this sort of like this weird sort of other type of like culture and values that even like visibly is very different, right? Because you wear the hijab and things like that. So there is, when it comes to interrogating that and steel manning that, what I would actually say is that the Muslims have a very inclusive understanding of what those are, because we see ourselves as the children of Abraham as well. So it's not for me to say now, well, oh, look at those Judeo-Christian morality. Okay, if I had to try and make a defense of human rights, I could. No, that's not the case, because like I believe in human rights. I believe in freedom of conscience, freedom of religion. These are very valuable things that I think, like you have to give props to modernity for what it brought, right? But the Islamic concepts are not like in opposition. It's you have Isaac and Ishmael, the children of Abraham. The Jews and the Christians came from Isaac. We came from Ishmael, in the kind of like that theological sense. So when it comes to like a family of values, then what do we stand for? Well, I think the ideas of universalism. So even though the kind of modern conceptions of Judaism and Christianity might differ slightly, Islam believes that we're all creations under Allah. So therefore you resist the kind of Roman pagan tribalism identities, which makes you see yourself inherently more valuable than anyone else. Just because I've said the Shahada and you haven't, doesn't mean your life is worth less or more than mine or anything like that. Generosity. So zakat, for example, is the key pillar of Islam, where actually 50% of Muslims in the UK live on the poverty or under the poverty line. But as a community, they give more than 1 billion every year, right? So these are exceptional sort of stats and data, right? To actually show that, we're putting our money where our mouth is, that these are the real values that we bring to the table. And you only really need to actually spend time with Muslims. So there's, on the one hand, we can talk about, and I'm sure we will, the the theories, the philosophy, the books, and these sorts of things, and the dodgy, unreliable sources of history that give rise to a lot of these narratives. But you only really need to spend time with real Muslims on a day-to-day to understand like the generosity that they imbue because of their values. You know, the strong family unit, for example, is also important in these sorts of things. So, yeah, I kind of want to push back that in actuality, these are Abrahamic values and they're quite universal in the sense that there's strong overlap with what we share. But the modern depiction likes to oppose them in a binary way, which is just not really, no serious intellectual, for example, is going to...
It seems like we both agree on the fact that there are these Judeo-Christian values that actually largely overlap with Islamic values in a lot of the senses of them. But there are people that misinterpret these and perhaps politicize religions, as so often happens. You know, people like to speak about religious wars that have been fought, and there's this common misconception that the majority of wars in history have been caused by religion, which is just not true. So would you say that the Christian revival that we're seeing in the West, people speaking more about these Judeo-Christian values, as you've pointed out, it's actually just political sentiment and it's an anti-strategy rather than being for the values?
The way I see it, I think religion has become a mask for, again, this kind of pagan tribalism that the Abrahamic religions originally were sort of created to kind of unroot and fight against, right?
Unpick that a little bit for me. What does that mean?
So pagan tribalism is the idea that the tribe, right? Like, you know, my bloodline, my people, my clan are inherently superior because of our ways of life and our values. And actually, we don't share anything with other people. So the reason I kind of refer back to that a lot is because the sort of inception of Islam, so if you look into the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, he was born into a time in pre-Islamic Arabia, which was principally defined by its tribalism. So even Rory Stewart talks about it as well, how he called out J.D. Vance over Twitter, saying that his perception to migrants, or his perception to people coming over the border, from Mexico, is more akin to some sort of pagan tribalism, not real Christian values. Because the whole universalism point of being, you know, unified under one God, of being created by one God, is this idea that we all have the same capability to, or for virtue, for vice, one or the other is not better than the other, and things like that. So now in the modern day, when we hear the term Judeo-Christian morality and values, it's an identity marker. It's not actually trying to sort of, like, I've never heard anyone use that term seriously and talk about I believe the beatitudes or the blessitudes from the Bible. You know, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, right? This is in the book of Matthew, or like Matthew wrote this. Like, these values are not propagated as what is at the forefront of Judeo-Christian values. In fact, what they're saying is that we're just not those Muslims. We're not those Muslims who do those dodgy things and, you know, are addicted to grooming gangs and all these sorts of things, and things like that. So that's kind of what I mean when I talk about how religion now is more of a mask, if anything, for a very sort of human idea around, like, you know, any human can be corrupted. It doesn't matter what religion you are. It doesn't matter if you even follow a religion, right? People have a capacity to be addicted to power. And we've seen this, and this transcends cultures, it transcends religions. This is the story of man, right? So whether you are a Muslim crude oil leader who runs an autocratic state, or you're from Soviet atheist Russia, or you're, like, you know, Mao, or you're some capitalist billionaire who's addicted to power, like, we all can fall into the same traps. And religion is just used as a mask to say that actually those kind of black and brown bodies who do it, they're actually worse than us and we're much better.
There's a lot to unpick there, especially about the last point of black and brown bodies. Maybe we can go into that.
Yeah.
Why do you specifically hone in on that use of words?
Because the sort of same arguments that you see people say about Islam have been repeated throughout history. So even like if you take the grooming gang scandal, right? And this narrative that's perpetuated that these Asian brown men are trying to come for our white girls, right? They're endangering our little innocent British white girls. That same narrative was used in the Jim Crow era, talking about how Black Americans are, or like, you know, like the slaves and stuff are here to endanger the pure white Americans and things like that. So there's a lot of parallels throughout history where actually a lot of this is, like, if you have to say it as it is a cover for racism, because there is just something, again, and honestly, I keep coming back to the pagan tribalism point, because that is literally just how I kind of see the world now. There is something just very simple about the fact that people can't get their head around how, if people are visibly different and supposedly share different values, there must be some sort of value judgment around whether they're inferior or superior. And it's a very easy like lie to propagate to that from elites. So this is like a top downward thing, to basically explain why people's lives are not going the way they are. It's a scapegoat. It happened to the Jews, like I said, if you come back full circle, throughout most of like late modern European history.
I think there's always a risk that people are going to be used as scapegoats. And this conversation about Black and brown bodies, sort of an alien culture, as some people would put it, just an alien look, something different to your eyes coming to you. That's an important conversation for us to have. And maybe there is a question of if people are just scared of people that look different to them. I think in the case of grooming gangs specifically, it's not about race. It's about culture. And I think this is sort of the overarching question for people. It's not, look at these Black or brown people. I think we're pretty far past that in the UK, mostly. Of course, there are going to be some disgusting racists. Always.
Can't get rid of them.
But the vast majority aren't like that. I think this is a question of culture. And you see with the grooming gangs, the stats come out, and Pakistani men are 4 times more likely to have been perpetrators of this grooming. And it's such an uncomfortable conversation to have, and one that can very easily slide into, look at these foreigners, they're just a different, inferior type of person because of their skin. I want us to stay as far away from that as possible. But there is a serious question to be had of why that's the case.
Well, yeah, I'd actually even push back that. So it is the case that these grooming gangs happened, and there were Pakistani men who, I mean, it's disgusting what they did to these young girls in these like particular areas across the UK. I don't know about the kind of 4 times more likely. So because a lot of the evidence and the reports that went out at the time to break the stories were pretty much cherry picked. So it's like a post hoc rationalization of the fact that, okay, there are these cases of grooming gangs where Pakistani men did these things. Therefore, it must be the culture that caused them to do these things. So a great book on it, actually a great chapter in a book on it, is from Peter Oben on the fate of Abraham, right? So this is what he writes. And this is an English conservative, small c conservative journalist. And he breaks it down in a beautiful way. I would also push back on and I'll explain what he says. So I push back on the kind of like, it's not racialized. I think it's both racialized, and I think it's hard to prove something's like racist when people hide behind culture, right? But like if we read between the lines, like ultimately it is like the kind of Black and brown bodies who bear the brunt of it when it comes to culture being an explainer for why these people do these things, notwithstanding the fact that these Pakistani men actually grew up in Britain for most of their lives, right? But, you know, people are going to forget that and just think that they just came fresh off the boat from Pakistan to do what they did. But actually, Sajid Javid and Priti Patel and other brown bodies perpetuated these kind of like narratives and actually called for like the official investigation, right, into the child sex abuse scandal, and to really understand and motivate, is there really an ethnic link, right, between the actions of grooming gangs and their ethnicity and where they're from. So Sajid Javid was huge on this, 2017, 2018, because he's Home Secretary. He's pushing this, until it was finally released. But then the Home Office was like, okay, we're not going to release it yet. And people were like, wait, what? What, you've been like building this up for so long? And this is all on the internet. Like, you've been building this up for so long. Why are you not going to release it? The Independent put in a freedom of information request to the Home Office in 2020. It was denied. Home Office said, no, we need to kind of talk to the ministers about this and prepare things a bit better, blah, blah. And even the right-wing conspiracy started coming out that, they're just trying to protect what we already know, that there's something wrong with these agents and these sorts of things. So it finally comes out, and Priti Patel's Home Secretary at the time. And it finds that overwhelmingly people in charge and behind sexual abuse scandals, particularly these gangs, are of white British ethnicity. Everything falls apart. This was an objective inquiry from the Home Office. They had no sort of political agenda. It was the Conservative government at the time. Priti Patel then says, well, actually, we can still see there's something to do with the race. So she's ignoring the data. Strange. So,
why do you think she chose to ignore the data?
Well, I mean, she's a politician, right? And a lot of her support, and at the time she was kind of nearly teed up to be prime minister until she kind of flopped along her political journey. She was just trying to get support, to be honest. And, again, it comes back to this idea of the clan and the tribe. You're not addicted, or you're not well, I wish people were addicted to the truth, but no one wants to find the truth, right? They have a political agenda and they want to push it. And ultimately, that Home Office report shattered everything. But the people who talk about it today, they don't say much. And that's not to say we need to actually have a serious conversation around why these sexual abuse scandals happened, or to exculpate the people who did this. But what about all the other girls, right, who actually, and all young boys as well, who suffered from these atrocious acts committed by white English males, right? I'm not going to say it's because of your culture. Right, I'm not going to say that to you, because it's obviously not because of your culture. Again,
just to jump in on this, because I think it's important to clarify. There were more from white British men because there are more white British men, but statistically speaking, relative to the population, the stat of Pakistani men being 4 times more likely to be in these grooming gangs does bear out, and I think that's a very important distinction not to miss out.
So in the Home Office report, if you read it, they say that there is some evidence that suggests that maybe black and brown people are disproportionately disproportionately capable, or I'm losing my word. Disproportionately committing these crimes. Sorry. But even they say in the conclusion themselves that there's not enough evidence to suggest this, because even the 4 times more likely stats, which I actually haven't seen, like I said before, but a lot of these stats that come out that are perpetuated by the right wing, where they're taking their sample size from, are headlines and media reporting of it. So there's an inherent bias in what the media reports, because they report things for a story. Okay, so with the inherent sensationalizing of these narratives, I'm not surprised that the disproportionate stats kind of come out. But ultimately, again, it's literally the Home Office 2020 report. They even say there's not enough evidence to suggest any of this. And actually, they find it from a bunch of cultures: Lithuanian, Jamaican, Somali, English, you name it. All the cultures are there. If anything, for me, I think it's a bit more of a man problem. Right, there's something to do with men and the kind of exploitation of our power over the vulnerable and things like that. But again, these narratives that is particular to a culture needs to be put to rest. Even the most prolific pedophiles in our history, white men, Epstein, Jimmy Savile, Prince Andrew. No one's ever going to talk about how it's because of English culture, because it's not. And it's not because of Pakistani culture, and it's not because of any other culture. It's a human problem.
Well, I think just to chase up that point about Jeffrey Epstein and Jimmy Savile and whoever, they're outliers. So I don't think there's a strong argument to be made based on these one-off billionaires, literally 1 in a million people. But
why not?
I take because they're statistical anomalies.
But then why can't their culture still be the explaining factor because of that? Because there's still those large samples. There's a larger sample size, even if you take absolute numbers around them committing these crimes because of their culture. I could actually make that point because there's a greater sample size to back it up, but it's just a stupid point, so I wouldn't make it. Do you know what I'm saying?
I don't see what you're saying. They're statistical anomalies, and they're not 4 times more likely to be involved in the grooming gangs. That's the difference. They are one-off billionaires exploiting their power, which is disgusting.
No, but so Okay, so what I'm saying is, no. So they're anomalies in the sense that they're rich, right? But they're not anomalies in the sense that they're white British or not Epstein, so we're putting aside. But they're white British males or English males who did this, right? So what I'm saying is that on the one hand, the 4 times thing, I need to check that. So I'll just take your word for it. That might be the case.
Sure.
But even still, I kind of explained why these numbers might be like there's not really much confidence, academic confidence, that is, in taking those numbers at face value because of like the source and the sample selection and things like that. But I'm saying it's as easy to make the case for white British culture being the cause of these like acts, which I will never do because I don't believe it, because it follows the same logic.
I don't want us to get caught up on
we don't
this
go back and forth
for too long and go back and forth.
Yeah.
But it just doesn't sit right to me not to close this loop. Of course, there are going to be discussing things that happen in a white British culture, and I wish they didn't happen. But if statistically another culture comes in and they are more likely to perpetrate it, that clearly demonstrates something.
I mean, but the Home Office report didn't say that, so
there's no point getting caught up on it.
No, but I'm just saying, like, you got to just like put that, like, from my side, anyways. I got to put that to bed.
Yeah, and I don't want us to get sidetracked because I really want us to keep this theme of speaking about actually how Islam has been misidentified in the West and how it gets misrepresented. What would you say is the general consensus in the media at the moment in the UK? You saw people in the Podcastistan sphere.
Wait, Podcastistan, wait, what?
That's the name for the podcast hubs. It's Podcastistan.
Oh, I didn't hear that. I've heard Londistan before.
No, it's nothing racial. It's basically describing a bunch of white dudes in front of microphones, like myself. Nothing to do with like.
Sorry, I was getting my head was
the Islamification of the podcast world.
Might be happening next. You guys got to be careful.
People in the podcast sphere, they were before complaining about a media ecosystem dominated by the left, that the BBC is biased and they never give any credence to right of centre ideas or even just classical liberal ideas like freedom of speech, that they clamp down on it. That was the argument a few years ago. We've now seen that completely turn on its head, and there's been the emergence of GB News, who was set up a few years ago, but who are now really motoring on, and they seem to be getting more clicks than ever. How would you say the sort of water that we swim in, so to speak, is in regards to the attitudes towards Muslims in the media right now?
Well, again, so GB News, unlike other news outlets like the BBC or like ITV or Channel 4 or something, they're a private company, and as a private company, they need to basically make money, and the way they make money is that they get clicks. And the way to get clicks is actually to produce stories and sensationalized media to grab attention. Because again, I mean, you post content online, I post content online. There's all the attention economy. Even I think like, oh, how can I like get the hook right just to get people's attention, right? Yeah. It's a real thing that you have to do. So then obviously with the sort of structural incentives that way, GB News has to sell a product, right? It's business at the end of the day, and their product, they know their target audience. Their target audience are people who have actually not have much contact with people who are not like them. So they live in like the kind of rural, like non-diverse areas. And ultimately they probably are quite, like proud of their country, like quite nationalistic and these sorts of things, patriotic, sorry. And ultimately they will just basically peddle the narratives that allow them to engage that same group of people. So where does Islam come in that? Then they play the role of the scapegoat and the other, again, kind of like what we spoke about earlier, where actually there needs to be a fall guy, right? And it's not the well, I don't know if there's billionaires involved, but I think there might be in like GB News or the rich people and that elite class.
They fund it.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So thank you for confirming that. Yeah. It's not that elite class. They want to keep the eyes away from them. The fact that people with real power are lobbying our government to actually make dreadful policy decisions. But actually, it's the poor migrant that washes up on shores and is the real kind of like perennial problem.
Something that I constantly ask myself, being in Gen Z and consuming a lot of media online, YouTube, or I've stopped with TikTok now. I think it's an absolute cesspit.
Is it?
But YouTube seems to be the more substantial source of information for me, which sounds comical to say because YouTube is still just another form of social media.
Yeah.
How do we navigate this media landscape and actually make sure that we're consuming substantive content?
Honestly, it's hard, I think. I think like, so even if I use my like Islamic like knowledge, the first line ever said in the Quran was "Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq," right? Which means read in the name of your Lord, right? So the first words ever told to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was read, or like recite, or learn. Okay, it wasn't scroll on TikTok, it wasn't or anything like that. So I think we need to pick up books again, to be honest. And I'm sort of lucky I was in the last year before ChatGPT came out at university, because even that, right, the fact that like we don't need to use our critical capacity anymore, and constantly with the new inventions and technology, we're overstimulating ourselves and just being able to just take in any media that sort of gives us those dopamine hits. I'm probably not optimistic about where things are going. I think, to be honest, it's important for people not to kind of put us on a pedestal or whatever. Like, you know, I respect what you do. You're trying to get to like conversation, like real discussion. You actually have to come to those mediums and adapt to it. And actually put out content that actually helps people. So that I heavily post on TikTok, and most of my followers are there. And I post like 3-minute, 4-minute videos, and that's like very long for like a TikTok platform, and they do really well. So I think it's about adapting the way we push media and coming to these platforms. But also, interestingly, I do think people are getting fatigued. So we might see a little comeback for like the long form and things like that. But I'll be interested to hear your thoughts as well on that.
I completely agree. I kind of speak about this anti-clickbait phenomenon that goes on, where actually by uploading a screen grab of a YouTube video, instead of spending time in Photoshop making this hammed up thumbnail with explosions and bright red colors and a pair of boobs on the front, you just you do a screen grab, and it's so basic and boring that it is a new form of clickbait, because everything else is clickbait and slop. So it stands out. And I see that increasingly. People who are podcasters, they're uploading vlogs, for example, real life content, and they'll give it the most boring title and it'll get 1 million views, because people just sense that there's something inauthentic when there's constant debate, no substance, World War III, end of the world, etc., etc. I don't know if it's going to just change like that. I feel like we kind of go in waves where some content will dominate for a month, then people get this yearning for the dopamine they once had, so debates dominate again with no substance. And I think you kind of just have to be aware of that as a content creator and ride the wave a little bit whilst still keeping respect for your audience and making sure that all your content has value. But it's very tough, especially with people's dopamine systems engaged. I do really think that riding of the wave messes up the opportunity of something just radically changing and becoming, you know, beautifully substantive and boring titles, and maybe we like get rid of thumbnails on YouTube. Maybe that's the solution. But I'm not optimistic either. I can see it flip-flopping about, but every wave and every trough, when we go back to explosions in World War III, it seems to gradually get more and more dramatic before we then ease out of it. So I think we're on a downwards trajectory. I don't know where we're going to go from here, but I'm not too optimistic short term. Yeah,
well, that's a great conclusion. No, I mean, I'm sympathetic to that idea as well. I think life is quite cyclical. So I do think the only sense of optimism I have is like this idea of fatigue. So if people get tired and they actually feel like they want more, then they might, you know, go pick up a book again, start reaching out to like longer form pieces of content, things like that. But honestly, only time will tell.
Yeah, well, you see the emergence of these dumb phones where people are paying extortionate amounts of money to have a phone where they can't download Instagram or Apple Maps even, or whatever. Just the basic calling function.
Well, it's addiction, right? Like that is really the sort of business model, to keep you addicted to your phones and things like that. And actually, that's why it's quite helpful that a religion like ours has like a month a year where you completely fast, and then you take time to like really step back from all the worldly pleasures possible and like just be with yourself. And that's not like an inherently Islamic thing. Like the spiritual sages across religions throughout history all advocated for fasting. So maybe people need to pick up some fasting.
Talk to me about your experience of converting to Islam and studying at Oxford University whilst this was all unfolding.
Yeah, no. So the Oxford was like a great experience. Like I said to you before, like we started filming. I'm literally from Enfield, North London.
That is ends.
Yeah, it is ends. Like, as in, bro, I know like a lot of people who've like gone down complete opposite paths to me. People gone to prison, things like that. And so I was never near, as in I was near that in like a sort of proximity sense, but I kind of kept my head down, studied hard, and got into Oxford. Once I was there, I think all my life I've kept close to me the idea that there was something more. It didn't feel intellectual at times. You know, you read these philosophical books and you're like, okay, well, you're just being silly, right? Because you can't prove anything beyond like the senses or anything like that. But it's something that you can't shake, right? Like there's something that kind of sits close to your heart. And even the understanding that this world is fundamentally mysterious, right? I feel like even atheists can understand that, right? The fact that like, how did we get here? Why we ask all these questions, like why is nature so beautiful? Like why can I take a hike in, I don't know, like the Lake District and think, wow, this is just amazing, but why do I feel that way, right? The kind of evolutionary biology, like, you know, you would mutated this way to feel that way. I don't know.
Yeah, what is this feeling of beauty or love or consciousness that I experience?
Exactly, like right? Like the fact that you, like the person that I've like loved most in the world is my grandma, right? And these sorts of experiences, you can't really put into words. So that's always sat with me. And then I think I was approaching the end of university. I didn't know what I wanted to do after university, because everyone with the flashy PPE title to their name goes on to like make a bunch of money. And I thought that could have been me. I tried it. Then I thought this is just soul crushing, soul destroying. So after university, I went with my friends, and this was planned a long time ago. So we took a trip to Morocco. We thought it was going to be a city boy trip. Like we thought we were going to be like proper city boys, yeah. But then our inside joke is now we were city boys, because city is like an Arab term. And we stayed in an area called Sidi Mamoun. And it turned from a trip where we thought we were going to get up to nonsense to actually opening all of our eyes. So not necessarily just to Islam, but just like it's a quite introspective trip, right? Like you're meeting people from the mountains, homeless people. It was the first time I ever like kind of traveled out really to a place like that. And I remember everyone sort of saying one thing to me, and this felt weird. It felt like I was in a movie or something, because people kept telling me, through Allah, I'm rich in the heart. Like, this is how I am. And I was just thinking, damn, like richness of the heart, like that sounds like something I want. Like, how do I get that? I kind of want that, because you do feel sort of alienated sometimes. Like all young people in their 20s do feel that way when the only sort of lifestyle that's pushed to you is to get a corporate job, make a lot of money, and like, you know, the life keeps on going. And that's okay if you like it, but I think I was just really wanting to understand for myself what it meant to be fulfilled. And in all my time studying at the greatest institution in the world, right, with the greatest philosophers in the world, no one really talked about that, right? Because even there, you know, you're just churning out essays to do well in exams, right?
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
You're surrounded by some of the greatest minds on the planet, yet you don't feel like this rat race has been avoided by these minds at all.
Definitely not. I think there's some people who can escape down the academic route, but then even there, you have to be a genius. I was never a genius. Like I got in there, I did my thing, got my 2-1 left, yeah. So shout out to them lot who actually kind of made it on and went further. But for the most part, a lot of us were just trying to get a degree that allowed us to go into a good job. And the circles I was part of was very superficial, very materialistic, right? People were rich. They came from like prestigious backgrounds. So this was just the next level of prestige until they went to that corporate job or things like that. So came back from Morocco, and I actually went into the civil service for a bit. And then I just started to read about Islam, to be honest, because that experience happened. And also, even though I converted to Islam, I was raised by my mum and my grandma, and they had an Islamic background. So my grandma was still sort of Muslim, but not like really practicing. But then she got diagnosed with dementia. And like even having this, really what I'm getting to the crux of is experience. it's not about like books and like reading and all these sorts of things. It's actually like lived experience that kind of opens your mind. And I want to remind me on that point, because I want to touch back on the GB News lot when we come full circle. But I don't think you really understand life until you experience death. Particularly the close ones. And my grandma with dementia, I saw someone who I loved, who raised me, just losing her mind every single day. But the only thing that stayed in that entire process was her religion. She started saying her prayers again and walking around the house like muttering this Arabic gibberish that I had never understood and she never said before. So it was a culmination of all these things, and I could honestly speak for a long time, but it's these experiences that started leading me to read more about it, question it a bit more, and actually and as I started reading about it for a period of like 6 or so months, I felt like I was kind of unlocking the secrets of the universe a bit, that type of stuff. And it's something that's situated deeply in my heart until the point at which I said, you know what, this is something I want for me. And again, the kind of like level of thinking that to get you there is a whole nother conversation. But I would just say that in the Quran itself, it talks about knowledge acquisition through the heart. And that is an experiential that's in the experiential realm. So actually trying to articulate is very difficult, but the simple things of really understanding the generosity of Muslims, the community, the beauty of the prayer, the Quran, listen to recitations, going to mosques, it felt something that was second nature to me, to the point where I was like, I don't know if this is true, but I want this to be true. Which you can't always apply that to your life, because you can't really apply that to different situations. Otherwise, you're just a bit delusional. But it came to a point where actually I thought, you know what? I think my heart's here. And actually, this realm, this other world, is profound. There's profound intellectual, philosophical backgrounds and these sorts of things. And I found the right community as well. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there seems to be this real need for religion amongst people our age. There's this God-shaped hole in us all that needs to be filled. I'm not religious, but I certainly see the utility of religion.
Yeah, of course.
And what does fascinate me is, first of all, probing people on if they think they would be a Muslim had they grown up in a Christian family, for example, and vice versa. Would someone have been a Christian if they'd grown up in a Muslim family? So it'll be interesting to hear why you distinctly follow Islam rather than Christianity, that shares a lot of the foundational values. But also, even just from my own experience, going to Medina in Saudi Arabia.
That's crazy. I don't even know. What were you doing there in Saudi? Like, just
I was doing videography.
Oh, okay.
So I've been in Alula, which is on the west side of Saudi Arabia. It's actually cursed, I think, in Islam, or it was.
Yeah,
and then they kind of just lifted that curse when they needed tourism. Well, I don't know. From what I've heard.
Well, I think Saudi is a very particular form of Islam. It's not really like traditional orthodoxy, but that's another discussion.
That's another rabbit hole. But then I went to Medina, which has the second holiest mosque in Islam, the Haram.
Man, okay, man, like.
And, and I visited that with a friend who took me there. And it was absolutely magical. Going to this building.
It's awe-inspiring, bro.
These ornate arches as far as the eye can see. And these beautiful carpets just lining the floor. And this overwhelming sense of peace. That's what really transcends everything else, is this general feeling of peace. I've never felt so safe in my life.
Me too, bro.
That's when I walked into that building. Maybe building's a bit of a secular term.
No, it's fine. It's a building.
What really struck me as an atheist sort of observer from the sidelines was the ritual to it. And I think that it's probable to me that all of these different religions implement certain things that play on the human condition, but the fundamental historical facts aren't actually true. Take, for example, praying 5 times a day. You're escaping scrolling from TikTok, you're being mindful, and you're connecting with perhaps the shower thoughts that you should have had throughout the day when you were too busy being overstimulated. So you've got that, you've got the physical act of washing yourself before praying, and that to me is a form of sort of self-nourishment and cleansing away actual physical dirt as well as spiritual means to an end. So for me, what I struggle with is there are all of these beautiful things and sort of things that could equate to gym bro personal development tools if you want to be super crude about them. That doesn't necessarily mean they're true, but also you could flip it against me and say, well, these things work because they're gifts from God. I suppose the only way to square that circle is to ask why you actually think those things are from God and why you don't just think that they are material facts and results of the way that we've evolved in an atheist world.
Well, I think there's on this topic of coming to religion, there's two questions you have to ask. Does God exist? And if God does exist, what conception of God do you believe? So the first question is can just really be a logical one. So you can get into the logical philosophical arguments for it and things like that, which, to be honest, obviously I subscribe to things like the contingency argument and things like that. I think there's a great sort of value to the the design argument, all these sorts of things. But even then, right, the kind of arguments of logic just always end at a loggerhead situation. Then when it comes to that second question, so why particularly Islam and not anything else, I think it really, for me, is about which religion understands the human nature the best. And actually, yeah, there's a lot of utility to it, but trying to sort of cut that off from the divine providence, I don't think it would have had its resilience, right, if it wasn't true. So what we're saying is that these prayers of 5 times a day, the Quran itself, the way, the direction Muslims pray, all these sorts of things, this has been going on throughout human history for the last 1400 years. And that unity was something that I thought was pretty spectacular. The sort of perceived lack of corruption, right? Because of course there's different branches like Shia, Sunni, all these sorts of things, but the core fundamental 5 pillars and all these sorts of things we all pretty much agree on. And someone a good scholar told me it's 80% of the things we agree on, 20% we don't, but the 80% is really solid and really valuable. I also like how Islam talks about the demand for a Muslim to do good in this world. So something like Christianity, for example, is you believe in Christ and that his cosmic sacrifice is enough for you to, be free from sin. And then that's it. The story really ends. Then you can get to go to heaven. That's it. That's not really how Islam works at all, actually. We don't have a concept of original sin. If man had an original sin, it'd probably be that we're a bit forgetful, right? So it's through the remembrance of God that we come back to the straight path, right? This idea that we need to tap into our higher selves to reach fulfillment. So there's so many layers to Islam, which is deeply profound, and ones that I thought that I've never come across a philosophy or way of life that as profound as that before. But when you ask so but what's the thing that gets you over the line, right? Because I always say that the leap of faith is bridging the gap between the limits of your logic and the life of the divine. It has to be moments I think about my experience. Not that God spoke to me and then I got a revelation. That don't exist. That doesn't exist in Islam. But the fact that the moments of my grandma, the times that I actually remembered, because when you have dementia, you forget the other person as well. I couldn't remember who this is my second mom. I couldn't even remember her. I was a young carer as well, taking care of her after school, giving her tablets, seeing her deteriorate, the mood swings, cleaning up after herself, that type of stuff. This was tough. But the only time in my life where I actually felt close to her and I could remembered who that person was when I was saying my prayers with her, when she remembered them back, when in this particular life, or in this particular time of my life, that was something that sticks in my heart the whole time. And it felt like just this series of events led me to that natural conclusion that this is what I had to do. So it's very personal as well. So I think it's very hard for people not from that realm to really understand that.
Sure.
And I completely understand, because bro, I was there, man. I was there. I was yeah, this is cool, this is nice, but is it true? I don't know. Allah guides who he wills. That's from the Quran. So I felt and I think I have been guided, and this is the life I live. Inshallah, same can happen to you. Who knows?
Shukran.
Strong.
Yeah, strong. Something that you've rightly pointed out is this idea of original sin in Christianity.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that I really respect and admire with Christianity is that there is no fooling God. Ultimately, it is what's in your heart. And we all may be born into original sin. But ultimately, what really matters, what gets you through those pearly gates when you die, is that you truly accepted Jesus into your heart. And that doesn't mean saying that you're accepting. It doesn't mean acting like you accept him. It's in here. And God knows that that's the case. Do you ever feel like Islam can sometimes skip over what's in the heart, put the cart before the horse, so to speak, and focus on actions rather than what you actually think?
So I'm going to say in a blunt way, not at all, but I understand why you think that, and that it comes back to the kind of media perceptions of like Muslims and these sorts of things. Because like, oh, all these 5 times a day, like, why do you have to do that? The fast, why do you have to grow your beard that long? I mean, you don't have to grow your beard that long, but you get the picture.
Yeah.
It's the inner dimensions of Islam is okay. Let me start with this. People characterize Judaism, so I'm going to be so reductive right now, right? Very simplistic, yeah. So people characterize Judaism as something just the outer, right? They have all these laws. You go to Stamford Hill, you see like the phone wires that connect houses and things like that. Or I think it's in New York or something, so they can leave their house on the Sabbath because it still technically counts as they're inside. Like, there's so many laws and like loopholes they have to try and find to like kind of get around them. Christianity comes along and says, no, like, bun all that, right? Like, this is really just about accepting this one guy called Jesus into your heart. And particularly, it was more Paul, actually, if we want to get into like the Christian kind of scholarship type of things, where he kind of motivated this idea that it's very personal, right? Salvation is a personal thing. You don't need all these extra laws and all these that stuff, because, I mean, ironically, Jesus did follow them himself and things like that. But then Islam comes along and it finds the perfect balance between both ends, right? That worship and submission to Allah, right, is an act of both the inner and the outer, right? And it's all about, it's al-mizan, it's finding that balance. Even on the sort of global map, it's in the middle of like, you know, the East and the West. It's all about finding the equilibrium between these two things, right? Human beings throughout cultures, throughout history, have always been ritualistic. Like, with whatever culture you go to, like, there's been little rituals and things that people do. It keeps people grounded. It gives people that sort of physical grounding for those very kind of like spiritual things. But then also, what's the most important is the condition of the heart, the intentions before your actions. There's intense scholarship on all of these things, right? Even Sufism, right, which people try and think is not really like, is like some sort of like, I don't know, it's kind of like stereotyped as like some modern form of Islam. That is traditional orthodoxy. Al-Ghazali, throughout his whole life before he died, who's like probably the most prominent Islamic scholar like ever, he said that actually Sufism is the correct way to follow the deen, and Sufism is all about the inner conditions of one's heart, the purification of one's soul, before the outer, before trying to do anything, just like, you know, outside of one's own like being. So it's basically, honestly, I don't know what to tell you, man. It's just a lie, really, that Islam's all about the outer and there's no inner. And actually, it's more universal, right? Because take the point of the Christian theology around salvation, right? You have to accept Christ as savior. In Islam, it's not the case that you have to be a Muslim to go to heaven. Muslims don't know if they're going to go to heaven or hell. We only know the things to do to keep us on the straight path, the sirat al-mustaqim, right? So keeping us on the straight path is not as simple as like having a like belief, full stop, and that's it. It's about being a good person. And actually, like, people who aren't Muslims, yeah, they can go to heaven and hell if they really are a good person, if Allah judges them by their own tests and these sorts of things. Like, and that's not some like modern liberal take. That's like a traditional orthodox take. So that's probably what I'd say to that.
A lot of misconceptions being dispelled, and keeping with that, I'd love us to go and loop back to the sort of GB News panelists, people discussing multiculturalism and the fact that it's failed in their view. Do you think that they're correct in saying that there are fundamental tenets scripturally in Islam that are incompatible with our Western society as it is today?
Well, it would be helpful if you a bit more specific on
something like discourse around the fact that non-believers should be exterminated,
killed or something. Okay.
And these kind of classic big words being thrown about the fact that apostates from the religion should be killed. It would be fascinating to get into these kinds of things, because I think fundamentally, if they are true, there's a clear incompatibility here.
No doubt.
And it will be worth seeing if that is the case.
Okay. So, what does it say in the Quran? It says there's no compulsion in religion. To me, I have my religion. To you, you have yours. And one of the greatest sins a Muslim can do is, like, let's say I was a really bad Muslim and I turned you away from the faith, right? You living your life as not a Muslim, and all the kind of sins you might accumulate, right, come to me, because it was my fault that I did that to you, right? The Prophet Muhammad in his time, peace be upon him, never killed an apostate, never did any of those things. All of those like complete lies about like his character. It's like I'm taking like, you know, my knowledge from actual Islamic scholars. So at its core, right, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion is not a problem for Islam. In fact, the first pluralist constitution in the entire world, in human history, was written by the Prophet Muhammad. And it's called the Constitution of Medina, right? Where Jews and Christians were allowed to live against their own rules under the Islamic Ummah, the community. Cool. So there's that. Now, obviously, it's like, so where did all this apostate stuff come from, right? And we'll talk about it, because there's actual like history, right? So people need to first disassociate that initial kind of the early days, so to speak, the actual prophets kind of like examples, versus the people that came after him, which is scholars, humans, and all these sorts of things that followed the religion. So in pre-modern society, right, there has always been the sort of the main goal is stability and order, right? And there's always been a concurrent theme that God, right, has blessed those who have ruled, or something along those lines, right? Like the kind of success of rulers in this life is very dependent on how pious they are, something like that. So you'd actually get similar kind of quote unquote apostate laws in like Judaism. Like I think there's something around stoning in like Deuteronomy or something like that, if like you leave the religion. You have like the Romans, even though they were pagan or something, they believed in like sacrificing for God, just for like the rulers and these sorts of things. And I'm just bringing up those examples to say like, in this life, in that kind of context, across the world, doesn't matter what it was, religion was a key to stability, right? It was the binding fabric for society. Okay, so then you have Islamic states come along after, or not Islamic states, that sounds bad, but like the caliphs and all these sorts of things after the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And Islamic scholars write in their sort of like scholarship and these sorts of things that's been translated. So that's the key, that's been translated that apostates, right, must be killed, right? So people who leave the religion must be killed, right? So in our English translation of apostate, when we see that, we see it as, oh, what the hell? So people who leave the religion have to be killed. That's insane. I agree, that is insane. Yeah, I don't subscribe to that belief. But what did that actually mean in the Arabic context? Well, the word was slightly different. The word carried the connotations of rebellion, right? Because again, we're talking about a context where societal fabric, right, was heavily about religion, right? People were Muslim, like religion was not relegated, because we can't really comprehend it now, because religion is relegated to the private sphere, thanks to like Martin Luther and all these lot, yeah. But back then, and even in some like modern kind of Muslim states now, religion is in the outer field, in the outer space, like you know, the Islamic law is a big thing, all these sorts of things. So apostasy then was not about people leaving the religion. There were so many like prolific atheist Arab scholars who lived under the Islamic golden ages at the time in various different places, right? Who are very famous, like I think his name Al-Ma'ari is like a famous one, but people can search if they're interested. Hated Islam, cussed it out, hated the Hajj, thought it was stupid, that type of stuff. But these laws, right, were specifically for people who were who wanted to rebel, who wanted to cause mischief, who wanted to by leaving the religion, create a public scene out of it. That was the key. It was in the public perception. Now, even though that's the case, right? And then they wrote, oh yeah, you should kill them, blah, blah, blah. This was after they had multiple opportunity to recant, to basically say, no, like I'm sorry, I didn't mean that, or I lost my mind. Also, the people who did it, they had to have good mental faculties. They had to be like, like reason. It wouldn't be like, if they had a disability or something, and they just said this, like they wouldn't just be killed randomly. And also, you have to appreciate, well, why is it so important to have such a harsh penalty for like rebellion, these sorts of things? Well, we didn't have like CCTV cameras or like a police force or anything like that. Like to sort of maintain law and order across vast empire, you needed harsh punishments. That was the reality of it. And when you look into the actual historical cases of people who were killed for this type of apostasy, so actually trying to incite rebellion or doing it in a public way, it's very minimal. I'm not excusing it, right? Because even now, as Islamic scholarship moves into like modernity, there's debates around like, is this right? Like, because this is just an application of principle. It's not an application. Because now, if someone's like, inciting like rebellion or whatever, we call it treason or something like that. And like, to what extent does that actually harm societal fabric or blah, blah, blah?
Sure.
We can have like a modern conversation about that. But back then, that's how it was. But then now, because of like these narratives, that's how it's been mistranslated. And then now it's seemingly a core tenet of the faith. When, to be honest, in my 6 months of studying it, that didn't even come up. Like, I didn't even like come across that until I started seeing like things on GB News and all these lots. So I know that was a bit long, but I hope that explains it quite well.
And I must admit, before this conversation in preparation, I came into it convinced that there is an explicit doctrine in the Quran that commands apostates being killed.
No.
You see people like Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins in the New Atheism movement speaking about this and flogging it constantly as an argument against Islam and religion more generally. And then I did more reading, even on Quran.com.
Yeah. Cool.
And I wrote down these 2 quotes I picked out. One says, "Let there be no compulsion in religion." I'm going to butcher this. Surah 256.
Strong. All right, yeah.
And the other one says, "The truth is from your Lord, so whoever wills, let him believe, and whoever wills, let him disbelieve."
Yeah.
There's such a straw man that often gets built up around Muslims. And I do think that it's partly not helped by extreme wings of Islamists, fundamentalists. And the funny thing with spending so much time in Saudi Arabia, for example, is that there's no one who hates Islamic extremists more than Muslims, because they give the normal majority of Muslims a bad rap. But this was shocking to me. I mean, I was convinced, like, apostates directly commanded by the Quran to be killed. And the thing about the Quran that's unique to the Bible, correct me if I'm wrong.
Or like unique compared to the Bible.
Yes, is the fact that it's the direct word from God. That doesn't leave much room for error.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
Whereas with the Bible, it is human interpretation.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So if this was explicitly commanded, then there would be no way around speaking about it, because it's the direct word of God. It's not at all. It's nowhere there. The interpretations are there, but they're from fallible humans.
Yeah, of course.
So I was surprised in my own worldview there, and that I had kind of been guided down a route of belief by Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins. That did I just call him Richard Dawkins?
I don't know.
Dawkins.
Butcher his name. I don't care. It's fine.
That wasn't true.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, well, you'd expect that people like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins would have the kind of intellectual capability to understand that nuance, which then brings up questions. So why don't they when they talk about it? I think in their works, even like I'm not an expert on their works, but like I do think they obviously have a feeling that Islam is like significantly worse than the other religions. But when we talk about the most rampant like religious extremism in the modern world, I think it's Zionism, to be honest, and the kind of like death and destruction caused under that name. But they sort of like don't really call it out to that extent. I think Christopher Hitchens has a bit. But these are like Sam Harris, for example, and all these lot, they still kind of support that entity. So I think their own sort of internal kind of group is like riddled with contradictions as well, to be honest.
that's a whole rabbit hole to go down.
I know. Sorry for like just
we've just done. We've just done an episode on the Israel-Palestine conflict, so I'm keen to sidestep that a little bit, even though there's so much to unpick there.
I'm not an expert on that. So
yeah. But I want us to end on this. What do you see as the future of the UK, where more and more Muslims are coming to the country, and the country religiously is becoming more diverse? There's a rise in Christianity as well that seems to be sort of around the corner. People are more open to spirituality. That may convert to more Christians, more Jews, more Muslims. If you're someone in certain realms of media, you'd say that this is doomsday.
Mm-hmm.
Diversity is not our strength. This is going to be a catastrophe. If you're in other spheres, you're going to say diversity is our strength and this is going to be good no matter what. How do you see this playing out in terms of tensions or no tensions that will emerge in the next few years? And I think it's important to hone in on our generation specifically as well, who are perhaps of a different mentality to some people that speak about the good old days of England when it was all white, and sort of the minority of racists that do exist out there. I don't want us to do a straw man and speak about them. I want us to speak about the general population here. What do you see going on there? How is this going to unfold?
Now, look, to be honest, like I've done some of my videos, I've talked to people at right-wing protests who protest the migrants coming over and these sorts of things. Like, people aren't like bad people, even if they have all these views about Islam, whatever. It's that people are generally upset and there's a void to fill. And the people who are filling those voids, unfortunately, are the great charlatans of the modern age who can articulate these beautiful narratives that make people feel okay, but doesn't really solve their problems, i.e. scapegoating the Muslims and these sorts of things. So I think, because we are young people, and, you know, if it is our generation who are going to be the next leaders, we need to be able to open up space to have actual, like, meaningful discussion around these things. I think, even as, you know, in the late years, like this kind of movement of wokeism and like left-wing kind of like the nature of left-wing kind of people shutting down conversation, I think that's been a real thing. And I think like that's got to stop, right? And actually, you know, realize that people who, yes, they might have very like deeply disturbing ideas around, you know, Muslims and your culture and these sorts of things, or just left-wing ideas, that you still need to have conversation with them. But then also I think like, on the right, people need to be able to have a conversation around the fact that the supposed people who are pushing that movement forward don't necessarily have their interests at heart. Ultimately, there's more in common with poor people, no matter what race, creed, or color, than you do with like richer people, because really the things that unite people are class-based interests, because we live in a capitalist system. Okay, that's the real perennial problem that we're facing. And I'm not a Marxist, I'm not anything like that, but that's just true. You know, people can't put food on the table, people's bills are going up. Like, we need to have real conversations around that, and I think we need to move away from the identity politics of things to actually have that proper conversation. Because of course, like I call people out on like being racists. They might have a problem with like Islam, whatever. But then we're never going to get to the truth unless like we can like put that aside and actually have a general conversation around the fact that like our lives are not getting better. And I don't have the power to inflict change, and you don't. So who's not making our lives like get better? Whose fault is that? And then from there, I think the real conversation will kick.
I think we can all play our part. And something that does concern me is this idea of conflicting narratives. And I'm not just speaking about small things that we believe, things that we are motivated by to pursue a career or a specific job or a degree. Fundamental understandings of how the world works. When people have different narratives, it leads to problems, like we see in the Middle East with Israel-Palestine. There are fundamental disagreements there on who has promised someone land or how the world works. And I don't think there's any escaping this. It's nothing specific with Islam, although there are specific examples that I could give you that I disagree with Islam. But in my eyes as the atheist, it's more generally speaking religion and being able to die on a hill for points because it's grounded in God. And, I find myself often wishing that Christianity were true, because there's so much in the doctrine that I do agree with, but I'm not sold yet. I could be changed. You have Christians and you have Muslims with fundamental presuppositions that are different. And then you've also got these secularists like myself who in the modern era prioritize other things like freedom, perhaps.
Mm-hmm.
I see that in great contradiction with some of the more conservative values that are being brought both by Christians in the UK, Englishmen, but also Muslims coming over who are increasing the population to be more and more Muslim. I do see problems that will unfold. And to put it bluntly, I don't think that all components of cultures are equal. I think that there are many parts of British secular culture that are far worse than the culture I see in Muslim countries that I've lived in. Mm-hmm. But also, in the same vein, there are parts of Islamic culture that I disagree with fundamentally. And it pains me to go to Saudi Arabia and see women walking around in burqas. It really troubles me.
I mean, yeah, it's not Islamic culture, but that's like Saudi Arabian culture. But yeah.
Sure, but it's derived from the Islamic doctrine.
Wahhabism, but that's like a small bit. Because like, do you know what country I'm from? You probably don't.
No.
I'm from I'm from the Caribbean.
I feel like I saw this in your bio.
No, maybe,
or something.
Yeah. No, but I mean, I don't want to get in like a tangent because I understand like, look, cultures are different, right? But ultimately, like, I don't even think it's helpful to say like Christian culture or like Islamic culture, because like I'm a Muslim, but I'm West Indian. So then even like my culture is very different to like North African Islam.
Sure, and this isn't like me trying to do a catch-all term for all people in a certain religion. There are obviously subcategories within religions.
And even like, sorry, not even to cut you off, but like how Western Christians talk about, like completely ignore the Eastern Christians as well, right? From Eritrea, Ethiopia, Egypt, and these sorts of things. I think like, that's why I'm more interested in the thing. So there's overlaps, as we agreed. I'm more interested in where we overlap. Like, what's the common ground, and how can we start building from there the conversations that matter, as opposed to like, you know, the fact that I might pray 5 times a day versus like someone who goes to church on Sunday. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, that's a trivial difference.
Yeah.
But I do fear that these cultural differences, whether it's someone from the Caribbean or from England going over somewhere else, they will cause tensions because there's a fundamental misalignment in belief of how the world ought to work. And
but just help me understand, and I'm not being like stupid on purpose, like what do you mean about something that's a bit of like a less trivial difference?
Something like the idea of women being covered full body and submitting to a male partner, being shepherded by them or chaperoned by them, sorry. That is in complete misalignment with my Western secular ideals, and I wouldn't want to see that come into play in the United Kingdom.
But it's not in misalignment.
Just like freedom in Saudi Arabia, they wouldn't want to see me and a group of my female friends coming over and sunbathing on the beach half naked.
No, 100%. But then like secularism's about legitimacy, right? So it's not about truth.
What do you mean by that?
So as in, it's about creating a playground that allows people from different cultures and beliefs to like live together. So it's not whereas like the Saudi, for example, they believe this is the truth, right? So therefore like you have to live this way. So like, I don't know what the sort of like, so like you basically saying that, okay, obviously these principles are like something that you wouldn't subscribe to, but secularism allows, right? Because it's freedom of religion.
Yes.
Right? So I don't know what the problem might be, if that makes sense. If you truly subscribe to those principles, which I think is interesting, because when you uncover it beneath that conversation, it's like, well, you say that you believe in freedom of religion, but then people come here and practice their religion freely in a private way. Because obviously, if I'm fully covered as a woman, like not really making you do anything. So then, like, what's the fear? Do you know what I mean?
The fear is encroaching on fundamental rights that supersede the freedom of religion. So, of course, I believe in freedom of religion, freedom to believe what you want, and I'm not going to force a Muslim lady to not cover up if she wants to do that.
Yeah.
But there are also foundational parts of our society that we would not want to cede purely in pursuit of freedom of religion.
Yeah.
Like becoming a theocracy for the sake, well, I guess that's a bad example because then if you're a theocracy, you wouldn't have freedom of religion. But getting rid of freedom of speech for the sake of freedom of religion. We wouldn't want to dispose of that.
Being able to, like, criticize religions and things like that freely. Okay. So my thing is, maybe this is a hot take. I haven't been from these communities. No Muslims coming to try and take over. Like, no one's doing that. Like, it is just objectively true that you have a quote-unquote better material conditions here, or maybe once upon a time that was true, because now a bunch of, like, British men are moving to Dubai to have a better life.
That's me.
Exactly, yeah. That's really what, like, we're talking about here. So I actually think, like, a lot of these fears exist in the imagination, right? Like, you even said that you go into, like, Saudi, opened your eyes so much,
Absolutely.
Right? I think people need to travel more, have more conversations with other people, and actually, like, understand the world in a better way. Because even I saw like Connor Tomlinson come on your podcast right beforehand, and I really don't rate him at all. By the way, like, just saying that as a plain fact. But I don't think
Why not?
Because he's so close-minded, and he reminds me of the pagan tribalism that we spoke about earlier.
How so?
With the fact that, like, he spoke about, for example, the Windrush generation and coming over, and how, we treat them as if they're, like, holier than thou and they have a special privilege. Like, hang on, like, what? Like, who are you fighting? Like, it's a non-argument. Like, that sort of notions, like, you're arguing against yourself. You're creating a problem that exists in your imagination because you haven't gone outside to touch grass and actually meet Caribbean people, right? Where you have these misperceptions that are self-imposed. Because the truth is, like, even if you talk about that Windrush example, right? My granddad was Windrush. He came from Trinidad. They saw themselves as British. Like, this is what colonialism did. Like, they were promised that you're coming back to the motherland, right? My grandma, who's Muslim, went to a Christian school, grew up singing "God Save the Queen," right? This was how pervasive English colonialism was, and they always had dreams to come back to the UK. And actually, they contributed a lot by helping the labour force after World War II. So, but then, like, he sort of accepts that, but then says, "Oh, but, like, we're treating them in, like, a better way." Like, where, how? Point me to it. It makes no sense.
Well, I'll have to let him answer that with a debate with you on my show or something in the future.
Say it up.
We should definitely do that.
Yeah.
We've gone on a bit longer than I wanted, but it's important. We're having a great conversation
Apologies.
here.
No.
Please don't apologize.
Yeah.
I guess what I really want to close the loop on with what we've spoken about with culture and differences is the question of Britain having a right to uphold what they would call British values or cornerstones of democracy, as often gets put, over certain other religious, cultural practice. So something like the banning of the Burqa, because people would feel like it encroaches on British values or what we believe in as a democracy. Do you see the UK as having a right to do that? And I think maybe it would be useful to ask, do you see somewhere like Saudi Arabia having a right to do that to Britons who want to live in Saudi Arabia, bringing their culture there?
So the question is, do they have a right to... Sorry, could you just, like,
to limit certain practices that oppose fundamental values like freedom of speech, for example?
So, like, even if you come back to the apostate example, right? Like, throughout history, that structure of the competing tension between preserving order and stability and freedom of the individual has existed throughout human history. So do they have the right to do it? I mean, yeah, they do. Do I think they should do it? No, because I think, particularly with the Burqa example, it's based on faulty premises around the fact that it's about devaluing of women and things like that. I'm not saying that can't exist in certain cases where, of course, like, some women are mistreated by being forced to wear it or something.
But you would posit that that's the minority.
100%. Like, I think people need to realize that actually it was not just Islamic culture which has the history of, like, women veiling. right? It was actually something that was perceived as royalty, like untouchable, because a woman's beauty was just for herself, and it was up to her to decide who she wants to like show it to. And ultimately, it's just like another commitment to God. But anyways, I don't want to like digress on that. Look, people have the right to do it, right? Like, I think whoever's in power, like, this is just another sort of narrative of history. But ultimately, it's up to us to articulate why they should and why they shouldn't, why they should or why they shouldn't. So whichever way it goes, I don't know. But I think we need to just be ready to actually have that civil conversation about it. Because again, if we're talking about British values, that's what it is. I don't want to slip into no sort of autocracy, right? There's a reason I live here, not Saudi Arabia.
Yes.
So we need to play by that. And even in Islamic like law, there is like literally a duty for Muslims to respect the laws of the land. Not in a sort of appeasing way where the ruler, whatever the ruler says is right. That's Saudi. That's not like normal traditional Orthodox Islam. And that's what we believe. But like I said, I think people need to touch grass and just speak to a bit more Muslims to understand that.
Thank you so much for coming on the show, Sean. I hope this hasn't felt like too much of an interrogation.
It's fine.
I think these ideas are often quite difficult to flesh out, and
yeah, of course,
99% of people struggle to even do that. So I appreciate you coming on the show. It's been an enlightening experience, and I hope we can have another conversation again soon, because there's so much we just didn't cover. I felt like that so much recently on my podcast episodes that I need like another 3 hours with every single guest, because I kind of end up rushing through topics.
Of course.
But yeah, really appreciate you, man. Where can people find more of your work?
Just at Sean Ramiz, mainly TikTok. I might even launch a podcast soon. So who knows? Maybe you can be a guest on mine.
I'd love to.
Okay, cool.